My name is Dr. Joaquin Morales, and I'm a trauma surgeon who survived the first 72 hours of the zombie outbreak. When the solar flare hit Phoenix on October 15th, I thought losing electricity was our biggest problem. I was wrong. 3 days later, my patients started coming back from the dead, and I had to choose between my oath to save lives and my need to survive. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I need to tell you about the moment everything changed. It was 3:47 in the morning on October 15th, 2024, and I had just finished what I thought would be a routine 12-hour shift at St. Mary's Hospital here in Phoenix. My name is Dr. Joaquin Morales, but most people call me Flaco. I'm a trauma surgeon, and before that, I was a combat medic in Afghanistan. I've seen enough death and chaos to know when something's really wrong, and that night, everything was about to go very, very wrong. I was standing in the break room on the 3rd floor, waiting for the coffee maker to finish brewing. The hospital was unusually quiet for a Tuesday night. We'd only had a few trauma cases come through the emergency department, mostly car accidents and a domestic dispute that required some stitches. I remember thinking it was one of those rare peaceful nights where I might actually get some sleep before my next shift. I was reaching for my favorite mug when it happened. Every single electronic device in the building died at exactly the same moment. Not powered down, not malfunctioned. Dead. The coffee maker stopped mid-brew with a mechanical sigh. The fluorescent lights above me flickered once and went dark. My digital watch, which had been counting down the minutes until I could go home, displayed nothing but a blank screen. The constant hum of ventilation systems, monitors, and equipment that you never really notice until it's gone suddenly fell silent. The silence was the first thing that hit me. In a hospital, there's always noise. Beeping monitors, humming machines, the soft whoosh of ventilation systems. But now there was nothing, just an eerie quiet that made my skin crawl. I'd experienced similar moments during mortar attacks in Afghanistan. Those split seconds of absolute silence right before everything went to hell. I pulled out my phone to use its flashlight, but the screen was completely black. I pressed the power button, held it down, tried everything I could think of. Nothing. It wasn't just dead. It was like the device had never existed. I found a small flashlight in the break room drawer and made my way to the nurses' station, where I could see other staff members gathering in the dim emergency lighting from the windows. Dr. Martinez, our head of emergency medicine, was standing near the central desk looking confused. He kept trying to turn on the computer terminals, pressing buttons that did nothing. The nurses were checking their phones, shaking them like that might somehow bring them back to life. Everyone was talking at once, trying to figure out what was happening. Through the windows, I could see that the entire city of Phoenix had been swallowed by darkness. No streetlights, no traffic signals, no glow from house windows or office buildings. The city that never sleeps had gone completely black. It looked like someone had just erased civilization with the flip of a switch. I've been through blackouts before, but this was different. This was complete. I walked over to the window and looked out at the parking garage below. Cars were scattered throughout the structure, but none of their lights were on. No headlights, no dashboard displays, nothing. It was like looking at a metal graveyard. Dr. Martinez kept saying the power company would have everything back online within hours. He was trying to stay calm, keep everyone focused on the patients who were still alive and needed our help. But I could see the concern in his eyes. He'd been practicing medicine for 30 years, and he'd never seen anything like this either. That's when I remembered the patients on life support. Without electricity, without the ventilators and monitors and 4 pumps, they were dying. We rushed to the intensive care unit, where the nursing staff was already manually ventilating patients with bag masks. It was a scene that reminded me of battlefield medicine, where you make do with whatever you have and hope it's enough. I started organizing the staff into teams. My military training kicked in automatically. In combat situations, you don't have time to panic or overthink. You assess, you prioritize, you act. I assigned the strongest nurses to handle manual ventilation, sent others to gather all the battery-powered equipment we could find, and started making lists of our most critical patients. But even as I was coordinating the emergency response, something was nagging at me. Patient in ICU bed 12, a middle-aged man named Robert Kim, who'd been brought in earlier with severe injuries from a motorcycle accident, had started acting strange right before he died. I'd been checking on him around 2 in the morning, and he'd been unconscious, stable, showing normal vital signs. But something about him had seemed off. His body temperature had been running higher than normal, and there was this weird restlessness to his movements, even while sedated. Kim had died about an hour before the blackout, and I'd been the one to pronounce him. Standard procedure in a trauma case with massive internal bleeding. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been different about his death. The way his eyes had moved beneath his closed lids, like he was watching something we couldn't see. The way his muscles had continued to twitch even after his heart stopped. I pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the living patients. We had work to do. I sent teams to check on other floors, to see how the rest of the hospital was managing. The reports that came back weren't good. The pediatric ward was struggling to keep premature babies alive without their incubators. The cardiac unit was losing patients who depended on electronic monitoring and automatic medication dispensers. By dawn, when the sun finally gave us some natural light, I realized our situation was even worse than I'd thought. I went down to the parking garage to get my car, thinking I could drive to other hospitals or medical supply stores to get equipment we needed. But when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The engine didn't even try to turn over. I popped the hood and looked at the engine. Everything appeared normal, but I knew enough about cars to understand that modern vehicles depend on computer systems to function. Whatever had killed the electronics in the hospital had also killed every car in the parking garage. Except for one. My 1970 Chevelle SS was parked in the corner where I always left it. It was my father's car, a classic muscle car that I'd inherited and restored over the years. It was old enough that it didn't have any computer chips or electronic systems beyond the basic electrical components. When I turned the key, the engine roared to life like it was mocking all the newer, more sophisticated vehicles around it. I had no idea that old car would become the difference between life and death over the next few days. At that moment, it was just a relief to have some form of transportation. I could make supply runs, check on other medical facilities, maybe even get some answers about what was happening. The first supply run I made was to Phoenix General Hospital, about 15 minutes away. What I found there was chaos. Their backup generators had failed just like ours, and they were dealing with the same problems. Patients dying without life. Support, staff trying to provide care with flashlights and manual equipment, and a growing sense that this wasn't just a temporary power outage. But it was the bite wounds that really started to worry me. During my first day of driving between hospitals, I saw a pattern emerging. Emergency rooms across the city were treating an unusual number of patients with bite injuries. Not animal bites, human bites. Deep, vicious wounds that looked like they'd been made by someone who was trying to take a chunk out of their victim. I'd seen plenty of bite wounds in my years as a trauma surgeon. Bar fights, domestic disputes, psychiatric episodes. But these were different. They were too organized, too deliberate. Every victim told the same story. Their attacker had come at them without warning, without apparent reason, and wouldn't stop. They described people who seemed to feel no pain, who continued attacking even when they were obviously injured themselves. The bite wounds we were seeing weren't like anything from my medical textbooks. They were deeper than normal human bites, more ragged, like the attacker had been trying to tear flesh rather than just injure. And the victims all described the same thing about their attacker's eyes. They were bloodshot, sometimes completely white, but somehow the attackers could still see their targets perfectly. I started keeping a separate log of bite victims, something my gut told me was important. In Afghanistan, I'd learned to trust my instincts when patterns started emerging. Random violence usually isn't actually random. There's always a cause, always a source you can trace back if you pay attention to the details. By the end of that first day, I'd treated 17 bite victims across 4 different hospitals. The wounds were getting worse, more severe, and the stories were getting stranger. People described their attackers as moving differently, like they were sick or injured but somehow didn't care about their own pain. Several victims said their attackers had been bleeding from their own wounds, but hadn't seemed to. Notice, one woman, Maria Santos, had been attacked by her own neighbor, someone she'd known for years. She said he'd come to her door asking for help, but when she opened it, he'd lunged at her and tried to bite her face. She'd managed to get away and lock herself in her bathroom, but she could hear him outside, scratching at the door and making sounds that didn't seem human anymore. What troubled me most was that Maria's neighbor had been treated at our hospital just 2 days earlier. He'd been brought in with severe bite wounds himself, had died from blood loss despite our best efforts, and had been taken to the morgue. But Maria was certain it was him. She'd lived next door to the man for 15 years. She knew his face, his voice, his mannerisms. I checked our records when I got back to St. Mary's. The neighbor, David Chen, had indeed been our patient. He'd been pronounced dead at 11:32 p.m. on October 13th. But according to Maria's timeline, he'd attacked her at around noon on October 15th. That was over 36 hours after we'd declared him dead. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe Maria was confused, traumatized by the attack. Maybe it was someone who looked like her neighbor. Maybe the stress of the blackout was making people see things that weren't there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong with the whole situation. I kept hearing scratching sounds from the morgue, but figured it was just the building settling without climate control. Old buildings make all kinds of noises when their systems aren't running, but every time I walked past the morgue, I could swear I heard movement inside. Soft scratching, like fingernails on metal. As the second day wore on, the reports of violent attacks were increasing. Not just isolated incidents, but coordinated patterns of violence spreading through different neighborhoods. The emergency rooms were being overwhelmed with bite victims, and we were starting to see something that really worried me. The time between initial bite and death was becoming predictable. Most victims were dying within 6 to 8 hours of being bitten. It didn't matter how severe the wound was, how much blood they'd lost, or how quickly we treated them. There was something about these bites that was killing people on a consistent timeline. Like an incubation period for a disease, I started documenting the timing between bite and death, creating a chart that I hoped would help us understand what we were dealing with. But I was tracking death like a disease, not knowing I was actually tracking incubation for something much worse. The city sounds were changing too. During my supply runs, I could hear the difference in Phoenix's voice. The normal sounds of urban life had disappeared with the electronics. No air conditioning units, no traffic, no industrial noise. Instead, there was a lot more screaming. Distant at first, but getting closer and more frequent as the hours passed. I was starting to understand that this wasn't just about the power being out. This was about something much more fundamental breaking down. The infrastructure that kept our society functioning was gone, and people were starting to realize that help wasn't coming. At least not the kind of help we were used to. My military training had taught me to recognize patterns in chaos, and what I was seeing wasn't chaos. It was too coordinated, too systematic. The bite attacks weren't random acts of violence. They were following a pattern, spreading from specific geographic points outward like ripples in a pond. By the end of the second day, I was exhausted but couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about David Chun, about the scratching sounds from the morgue, about the bite victims who all died within the same time frame. I was missing something important, something that would help me understand what was really happening to our city. I decided to check on Chun's body one more time. I told myself I was just being thorough, following up on an unusual case. But deep down, I think I already knew what I was going to find. I'd seen enough death in Afghanistan to recognize when something wasn't following the normal rules. I made my way to the morgue with a flashlight, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. The scratching sounds were louder now, more insistent. I could hear them clearly through the morgue doors, like someone was trying to claw their way out of a metal box. I've pronounced hundreds of people dead in my career. I know what death looks like, what it sounds like, what it feels like when you're standing next to it. But as I reached for the handle of the morgue door, I realized that everything I thought I knew about death was about to change. The scratching stopped when I touched the door handle. Complete silence. I stood there for a moment, listening, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. But then I heard something that made my blood freeze. A heartbeat. Slow, irregular, but definitely a heartbeat coming from inside the morgue. I was checking on Chun's body when I heard something that changed everything I thought I knew about life and death. The heartbeat I heard from inside the morgue wasn't normal. It was too slow, too irregular, like a machine that was running out of power but somehow still trying to function. I stood there with my hand on the door handle, trying to process what I was hearing. In my 15 years as a trauma surgeon, I'd never heard a heartbeat from someone I'd personally pronounced dead 36 hours earlier. I opened the morgue door slowly, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The scratching sounds had stopped completely, but I could still hear that irregular heartbeat echoing off the metal walls. The morgue was small, just 4 refrigerated drawers built into the wall, but without electricity, the refrigeration hadn't been working for over 2 days. David Chun's body was in the second drawer from the left. I'd put him there myself after completing the death certificate. Multiple organ failure due to massive blood loss from bite wounds. Time of death, 11:32 p.m. on October 13th. I'd followed every protocol, checked for vital signs multiple times, verified with 2 other medical professionals. David Chun was dead, but as I approached his drawer, I could hear the heartbeat getting stronger. Not faster, just more pronounced, like it was getting closer to the surface. I pulled the drawer open and immediately stepped back. The smell hit me first, not the normal smell of death, but something else entirely. Something that reminded me of infections I'd treated in combat zones. That sweet, sickly odor of tissue breaking down while still alive. David Chun's body was moving. Not the normal movements you sometimes see in recently deceased patients, muscle contractions or gases escaping. This was purposeful movement. His fingers were slowly clenching and unclenching, his head was turning from side to side, and his eyes were moving beneath his closed lids like he was having an intense dream. I checked for a pulse at his wrist, then his neck. There it was. That slow, irregular heartbeat I'd been hearing. But his skin was cold, clammy, and had the grayish tint I'd seen in patients who'd been dead for days. His body temperature was registering about 85 degrees. Far too low for a living person, but too high for someone who'd been dead for over 30 hours. This was medically impossible. Everything I'd learned in medical school, everything I'd experienced in Afghanistan, everything I knew about human biology said that David Chun should not be moving. But there he was, slowly beginning to open his eyes. I'd seen enough death in Afghanistan to recognize when something wasn't following the normal rules, and this was definitely not following any rules I understood. His eyes, when they finally opened, were completely white. Not just bloodshot like the bite victims had described. but actually white, like cataracts had formed over his entire corneas. But somehow, impossibly, those white eyes focused directly on me. I started keeping a separate log of bite victims, because my gut told me it was important, and now I was seeing why. Every victim I'd treated had described their attackers the same way. White eyes, slow movements, no apparent response to pain. They weren't describing random violent people. They were describing people who had died and somehow come back. Chun sat up slowly, his movements mechanical and jerky like a marionette being controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, and I could see that his teeth were stained with dried blood. Not his own blood, but blood from the bite wounds he'd inflicted on other people before his death. I realized I was looking at the source of the bite attacks that had been spreading through Phoenix. These weren't random acts of violence by living people. These were attacks by people who had died from similar bites and then somehow reanimated. The pattern I'd been tracking wasn't a disease spreading through the living population. It was death spreading and creating more sources of infection. Chun turned his head toward me with that jerky, mechanical movement, and I could see that his neck wound from the original attack hadn't healed. It was still open, still bleeding slightly, but it didn't seem to bother him. He stood up from the drawer, his movements becoming more coordinated as he fully awakened. I backed toward the door, but I couldn't stop watching him. This was the most medically fascinating and terrifying thing I'd ever witnessed. A human being who had died from trauma was now moving around, apparently conscious, but operating on some different level of consciousness than normal human awareness. Chun started walking toward me, and I could see that his gait was wrong. He wasn't favoring his injured leg, wasn't compensating for the internal damage that had killed him. He was moving like someone who couldn't feel pain, couldn't feel anything at all except whatever was driving him to move forward. I'd treated enough bite victims to know that they all described the same thing about their attackers. They moved like they were sick or injured, but didn't seem to care about their own pain. Now I was seeing exactly what they meant. Chun was walking on a leg that should have been too damaged to support his weight, but he seemed completely unaware of the injury. I needed to get out of the morgue, but I also needed to understand what was happening. My medical training was telling me to observe, to document, to try to understand this impossible situation. But my combat training was telling me to run, to get away from something that was clearly dangerous. Chun reached the end of the drawer and stepped onto the floor. His movements were becoming more fluid, more purposeful. Whatever process had reanimated him was still progressing, still changing him into something that wasn't quite human anymore. I pointed my flashlight directly at his face, and he didn't react to the bright light at all. His white eyes didn't blink, didn't try to adjust to the illumination. It was like he was seeing through some method that didn't depend on normal vision, tracking me through sound or smell or some other sense I didn't understand. That's when I heard the scratching sounds again. Not from Chun, but from the other 3 morgue drawers. The other recent deaths were starting to wake up too. I could hear movement from inside the metal compartments, the sound of bodies shifting and hands scratching against metal walls. I realized that every person who had died from bite wounds in our hospital was probably going through the same process. The morgue wasn't just storing dead bodies anymore. It was incubating something that would soon be very much alive and very dangerous. Chun took another step toward me, and I could see that his mouth was moving like he was trying to say something. But the only sound that came out was a low, guttural moan that didn't sound like any human vocalization I'd ever heard. It was a sound that spoke of hunger, of need, of something that was driving him toward me with single-minded focus. I backed out of the morgue and slammed the door shut, but I could immediately hear the scratching sounds getting louder. All 4 drawers were now active, and whatever was inside them was trying to get out. The door handle started turning as Chun tried to follow me, but his motor skills weren't developed enough yet to operate complex mechanisms. I ran back to the nurse's station, my mind racing to process what I'd just witnessed. I needed to warn. The staff needed to evacuate the hospital, needed to figure out how to deal with bodies that weren't staying dead. But I also needed to understand the medical implications of what I'd seen. The time between bite and death was 6 to 8 hours. I documented that pattern carefully. But apparently, death wasn't the end of the process. There was another phase, a reanimation phase that took place about 30 to 40 hours after death. Chun had died at 11:32 p.m. on October 13th and had fully reanimated by around 4 a.m. on October 15th. That was roughly 28 and a half hours. I started calculating how many bite victims we'd lost in the past few days, how many bodies we'd sent to morgues throughout the city. If they were all going through the same process, if they were all reanimating on the same timeline, then Phoenix was about to face a crisis that would make the power outage look like a minor inconvenience. I found Dr. Martinez in the intensive care unit, still trying to keep our critical patients alive with manual ventilation and limited supplies. I told him what I'd seen in the morgue, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. He'd been practicing medicine for 30 years, and what I was describing wasn't possible according to everything he knew about human biology. But I convinced him to come with me to see Chun's empty drawer. When we opened the morgue door, all 4 drawers were open and empty. The bodies that had been inside were gone, but we could hear movement from other parts of the hospital. Slow, shuffling footsteps and that low moaning sound I'd heard from Chun. Dr. Martinez's skepticism evaporated when we heard the first scream from the 2nd floor. One of our missing morgue occupants had found a living person, and the cycle was starting again. The bite, the death, the reanimation. It was a process that was going to spread through our hospital, and then through our city, unless we found a way to stop it. I realized that traditional medical responses weren't going to work here. You can't treat a patient who's already dead. Can't perform surgery on someone who doesn't feel pain. Can't reason with something that's operating on pure instinct. We needed to start thinking about this as a combat situation, not a medical emergency. I sent teams to check on other floors to see how widespread the reanimation had become. The reports that came back were terrifying. 3 more formerly dead patients had reanimated and were moving through the hospital. They were attracted to sound and movement, drawn to the areas where living people were trying to provide medical care. We started hearing screaming from the pediatric ward, and I knew we were losing control of the hospital. The reanimated patients were finding their way to the most vulnerable populations first, drawn by the sounds of crying babies and frightened children. Everything I'd learned in Afghanistan about protecting civilians was suddenly relevant in a hospital setting. I organized the remaining staff into defensive positions, using furniture and equipment to create barriers between us and the reanimated patients. But I knew these were temporary measures. We needed to evacuate the hospital before more bodies reanimated, before the situation became completely impossible to control. The Chevelle was going to be crucial for evacuation. It was the only working vehicle we had, and we were going to need to make multiple trips to get everyone to safety. I started making lists of who needed to go first, prioritizing the most vulnerable patients and the staff members who were essential for their care. But even as I was planning the evacuation, I was also trying to understand what we were dealing with. The reanimated patients moved differently than living people. They were slower, less coordinated, but they didn't seem to get tired. They didn't respond to pain, didn't seem to have any goals beyond finding living people to bite. I conducted some quick experiments, watching how they reacted to different stimuli. They were attracted to sound, especially human voices. They could see movement, but their vision seemed limited. They were drawn to body heat, but they couldn't track it from long distances. Most importantly, they seemed to be operating on pure instinct, without any of the reasoning or planning abilities that made humans dangerous. This information was going to be crucial for our survival. If we could understand how they hunted, how they tracked their prey, we could develop strategies to avoid them. But first, we needed to get out of the hospital before we became their next victims. I was getting ready to start the evacuation when I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of multiple vehicles approaching the hospital. Not the Chevelle, but other vehicles, which should have been impossible given the electromagnetic pulse that had disabled all the electronics in the city. I looked out the window and saw military vehicles surrounding the hospital. Humvees and trucks that looked like they'd been hardened against electromagnetic interference. The cavalry was arriving, but I wasn't sure if they were coming to rescue us or to contain us. Soldiers in full hazmat gear were getting out of the vehicles and setting up a perimeter around the hospital. They weren't acting like a rescue operation. They were acting like a quarantine operation, like they were trying to prevent something from getting out rather than getting people out safely. I realized that we weren't the first hospital to experience reanimation. The military already knew what was happening, had already developed protocols for dealing with it. But their protocols apparently involved containment rather than evacuation, which meant they were planning to seal us inside with the reanimated patients. I needed to get my staff and patients out of the hospital before the military quarantine became complete. But I also needed to understand what the military knew about the reanimation process. Were they here to help us? Or were they here to make sure that whatever was happening in Phoenix didn't spread to the rest of the country? I watched as the soldiers set up barricades and communication equipment. They were establishing a command post, settling in for what looked like a long-term operation. This wasn't a rescue mission. This was a containment operation, and we were about to become the things being contained. The reanimated patients were still moving through the hospital, still finding new victims. Every person they bit would go through the same process Chun had gone through. Death in 6 to 8 hours, reanimation in about 30 hours. The cycle was accelerating, and soon the hospital would be full of creatures that had once been our patients and colleagues. I made the decision to begin evacuation immediately, before the military quarantine became complete. We were going to have to get past both the reanimated patients inside the hospital and the soldiers outside. It was going to require all of my medical knowledge and all of my combat training to get my people out alive. As I prepared to lead the first group of evacuees toward the parking garage, I heard something that confirmed my worst fears. The low moaning sound that Chun had made was now coming from multiple directions throughout the hospital. The reanimation process was accelerating, and we were running out of time. I knew that within the next few hours, we were going to face a choice between saving lives and taking them. The creatures that had been our patients were no longer people who could be treated or reasoned with. They were something else entirely, something that posed a direct threat to everyone still alive in the hospital. My combat medic training had taught me to make hard decisions under pressure, but nothing had prepared me for the decision I was about to face. I was going to have to choose between my oath to do no harm and my responsibility to protect the living. It was a choice that would change everything about who I was as a doctor and as a person. The choice between my oath to do no harm and my responsibility to protect the living came sooner than I expected. As I was preparing to lead the first group of evacuees toward the parking garage, I heard a scream from the intensive care unit that cut through all the other chaos in the hospital. It was Dr. Martinez, and he was calling for help. I ran back to the ICU and found him trapped behind the nurses' station with 2 of our remaining nurses. One of our reanimated patients, a woman named Patricia Williams who had died from bite wounds the day before, was slowly advancing on them. She moved with that same jerky mechanical gait I'd seen from Chun, but her reanimation was more advanced. Her movements were more coordinated, more purposeful. Patricia had been a kindergarten teacher before she was bitten. She'd been brought to our hospital with severe wounds to her arms and neck, and despite our best efforts, she died from blood loss about 6 hours after the attack. I'd been the one to pronounce her dead, to close her eyes and pull the sheet over her face. Now she was standing in our ICU, her white eyes fixed on Dr. Martinez with that same predatory focus I'd seen from Chun. What made it worse was that Patricia was still wearing her hospital gown, still had the identification bracelet on her wrist that we'd put there when she was admitted. She looked like a patient, but she was moving like a predator. The contrast between her familiar appearance and her inhuman behavior was disturbing in a way that's hard to describe. Dr. Martinez was trying to reason with her, talking to her like she was still the person she'd been before her death. But I could see that Patricia wasn't responding to his voice, wasn't showing any recognition of human speech. She was tracking him through movement and sound, but not processing the meaning of what he was saying. I knew I had to act quickly. Patricia was blocking the only exit from the ICU, and she was getting closer to Dr. Martinez and the nurses. In Afghanistan, I'd learned to make life and death decisions in seconds, but this was different. This was someone who had been my patient, someone I'd tried to save. I grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and approached Patricia from behind. She didn't react to my presence until I was close enough to touch her. Then she turned around. With that mechanical movement, her white eyes fixing on me with the same predatory intensity she'd shown toward Dr. Martinez. I had to make a choice. I could try to restrain her, try to find some way to contain her without causing harm. Or I could accept that Patricia Williams was no longer the person she'd been, that she was now something that posed a direct threat to the living people under my care. I hit her in the head with the fire extinguisher. It was a calculated blow, designed to incapacitate rather than kill, but I wasn't sure if traditional concepts of life and death even applied to her anymore. She collapsed to the floor, her body going limp, but I could still hear that slow, irregular heartbeat that seemed to be the only vital sign these reanimated patients maintained. Dr. Martinez stared at me in shock. He'd known me for 5 years, had watched me save countless lives through careful surgery and compassionate care, but he'd never seen me deliberately harm someone who looked like a patient. The expression on his face told me that something fundamental had changed in our relationship, in our understanding of what it meant to be a doctor. I checked Patricia's pulse and found that a regular heartbeat still present. Whatever process had reanimated her was still active, still maintaining some basic biological functions. But her movements had stopped, and she was no longer an immediate threat to the staff in the ICU. I realized that the traditional medical concepts I'd been trained to follow weren't going to work in this situation. Patricia wasn't alive in any meaningful sense, but she wasn't dead either. She was something in between, something that required a completely different approach to treatment and containment. I organized the remaining staff into defensive positions throughout the hospital, using my military training to create secure zones where we could treat the living patients while keeping the reanimated ones contained. But I knew these were temporary measures. We needed to evacuate the hospital before more bodies reanimated, before the situation became completely impossible to control. The scratching sounds from the morgue had gotten louder, and I could hear similar sounds from other parts of the hospital where we'd been storing bodies. The reanimation process was accelerating, and we were going to face more Patricia Williams situations unless we got out quickly. I assigned teams to different floors, with instructions to secure any remaining survivors and gather essential medical supplies. But I also gave them permission to use whatever force was necessary to protect themselves from reanimated patients. It was a decision that went against everything I'd been taught in medical school, but it was necessary for the survival of the living. The team I sent to the second floor came back with disturbing news. They'd found 3 more reanimated patients, all of them former bite victims who had died in the past 2 days. But these ones were different. They were moving in coordination with each other, like they were sharing some kind of communication or instinct that allowed them to hunt as a group. I realized that the reanimation process wasn't just bringing people back from the dead. It was creating something new, something that retained some basic human abilities, but operated on completely different principles. These weren't random monsters stumbling around the hospital. They were predators, and they were learning to hunt more effectively. The team also reported that the military perimeter outside the hospital was becoming more secure. The soldiers had set up barricades at all the exits and were turning away anyone who tried to leave. This wasn't a rescue operation. This was a quarantine, and we were the ones being quarantined. I decided to test the military's intentions by sending one of our nurses to the main entrance with a request for medical supplies. She came back 20 minutes later with the news that the soldiers weren't allowing anyone to leave the hospital. They'd told her that the facility was under medical quarantine and that all personnel were required to remain inside until further notice. This confirmed my suspicions that the military already knew about the reanimation process and had developed protocols for dealing with it. But their protocols apparently involved containment rather than treatment or evacuation. They were planning to seal us inside with the reanimated patients, presumably to prevent the spread of whatever was causing the reanimation. I understood their logic from a strategic perspective. If the reanimation process was spreading through bite transmission, then containing it to specific locations would prevent it from spreading throughout the general population. But from a medical perspective, their approach was essentially a death sentence for everyone trapped inside the containment zone. I made the decision to begin evacuation immediately, using the Chevelle to transport people past the military perimeter. The car was old enough to be immune to the electromagnetic pulse that had disabled modern vehicles, and it was small enough to maneuver through areas where the military barriers might be weaker. But first, I needed to secure the hospital long enough to get everyone out safely. The reanimated patients were still moving through the building, still finding new victims. Every person they bit would go through the same process Patricia had gone through. Death in 6 to 8 hours, reanimation. In about 30 hours, I developed a system for tracking the reanimation timeline. Every bite victim who died was tagged with the time of death, and we established a schedule for checking their bodies before the expected reanimation time. If we could identify them before they reanimated, we could contain them more easily. The first test of the system came when James Rodriguez, a security guard who'd been bitten while trying to protect the pediatric ward, died from his injuries. I'd calculated that he would reanimate approximately 30 hours after his death, which gave us time to prepare. I set up a secure observation area where we could monitor James's body safely. I wanted to document the reanimation process too. Understand exactly what was happening to these people and how we might be able to prevent or reverse it. James's reanimation followed the same pattern I'd seen with Chun and Patricia. The slow return of that irregular heartbeat, the gradual return of movement, the opening of eyes that had turned completely white. But I was able to observe details that I'd missed during the more chaotic encounters. The process seemed to involve some kind of neurological rewiring. James's movements during reanimation were different from his normal patterns of movement when he was alive. His dominant hand had been his right hand, but as a reanimated patient, he seemed to favor his left hand. His gait was different, his posture was different, even his facial expressions were different. It was like the reanimation process was creating a new personality using the same physical body. James Rodriguez, the security guard, was gone, replaced by something that looked like him, but operated on completely different principles. The creature that had been James was driven by instincts that seemed focused entirely on hunting and biting living people. I conducted some basic tests of the reanimated James's responses to different stimuli. He was attracted to movement, sound, and apparently body heat. He could navigate around obstacles, but his problem-solving abilities were limited. He seemed to operate on pure instinct, without any of the reasoning or planning abilities that had made James an effective security guard. Most importantly, he showed no response to pain. I tested this by applying pressure to areas that should have been sensitive, but he showed no reaction. This explained why the reanimated patients could continue functioning despite injuries that would incapacitate a living person. I also confirmed that the reanimated patients didn't seem to tire. James had been moving continuously for over an hour without showing any signs of fatigue. This was going to be a significant advantage for them in any long-term conflict with living people. Armed with this information, I developed strategies for dealing with the reanimated patients. They could be incapacitated by damage to the head or spinal cord, but they could continue functioning despite injuries to other parts of their body. They were attracted to sound and movement, but they could be avoided by staying quiet and still. I shared this information with the remaining hospital staff and organized them into evacuation teams. We were going to have to move through the hospital, carefully avoiding the reanimated patients while gathering the supplies and people we needed to survive outside the building. The first evacuation run was scheduled for that evening, using the cover of darkness to avoid the military perimeter. I would drive the Chevelle to a secure location outside the quarantine zone, drop off the evacuees, and return for the next group. It was going to take multiple trips to get everyone out safely. But as we were preparing for the first evacuation, I heard something that changed everything. The sound of multiple vehicles approaching the hospital again. Not more military vehicles, but civilian vehicles that somehow were still working, despite the electromagnetic pulse. I looked out the window and saw a convoy of older vehicles, cars and trucks from the 1970s and 80s, that were old enough to be immune to the pulse. They were filled with people who looked like they'd been traveling for days. Dirty and exhausted, but still alive. The convoy stopped at the military perimeter, and I could see a heated discussion between the convoy leaders and the soldiers. The discussion quickly turned into an argument, and then into something that looked like it might become violent. I realized that we weren't the only people who had figured out how to survive in the post-pulse world. There were other groups out there, other people who had adapted to the new reality and were trying to rescue survivors from the quarantine zones. The convoy leader was a woman in her 50s who looked like she'd been a military officer herself. She was arguing with the soldiers, demanding that they allow civilians to evacuate the hospital. But the soldiers were holding their ground, insisting that the quarantine protocols had to be maintained. I decided to take advantage of the distraction to begin our own evacuation. While the soldiers were focused on the convoy, I led the first group of evacuees toward the parking garage. We moved carefully, avoiding the areas where we knew reanimated patients were active. The Chevelle started on the first try, and I was able to get the first group past the military perimeter while the soldiers were still dealing with the convoy. But I knew that this opportunity wouldn't last long. The soldiers would eventually resolve the situation with the convoy, and then they would tighten security around the hospital. As I was driving the first group to safety, I could hear something that made my blood run cold. The sound of screaming from the pediatric ward, getting louder and more desperate. The reanimated patients had found the most vulnerable population in the hospital, and they were doing what their instincts drove them to do. I realized that I was going to have to choose between saving lives and taking them. The reanimated patients were no longer people who could be treated or reasoned with. They were predators, and they were hunting the children and staff members who were still alive in the pediatric ward. I was going to have to go back into the hospital, armed with whatever weapons I could find, and fight creatures that had once been my patients. It was a choice that would change everything about who I was as a doctor and as a person. The evacuation was only half complete, but I couldn't leave the pediatric ward to face the reanimated patients alone. I was going to have to become something I'd never been before, something that could kill in order to save lives. As I turned the Chevelle around to head back to the hospital, I could hear the convoy outside engaging in what sounded like a firefight with the military. The quarantine was breaking down, and the situation was about to become much more complicated than just dealing with reanimated patients. I realized that within the next few hours, we were going to face threats from multiple directions. The reanimated patients inside the hospital, the military trying to maintain quarantine outside, and now unknown groups with their own agendas trying to break through the perimeter. My combat medic training had taught me to prioritize threats and respond accordingly, but nothing had prepared me for a situation this complex. I was going to have to make decisions that would determine who lived and who died, and I was going to have to make them quickly. The screaming from the pediatric ward was getting louder, and I knew that time was running out for the most vulnerable people in the hospital. I was about to face the greatest challenge of my medical career, and the greatest test of my ability to adapt to a world where the rules of life and death had fundamentally changed. The screaming from the pediatric ward was getting more desperate by the minute as I parked the Chevelle and grabbed whatever weapons I could find from the hospital's maintenance area. A crowbar, a hammer, and a surgical bone saw that I knew could cut through the spinal cord if I had to incapacitate one of the reanimated patients. I'd never thought I'd be using surgical instruments as weapons, but nothing about this situation was following normal medical protocols. I made my way to the pediatric ward using the back stairwell, avoiding the main corridors where I knew the reanimated patients were most active. The sounds I was hearing weren't just screaming anymore. There were other sounds, wet sounds that reminded me of the field hospitals in Afghanistan when we were dealing with traumatic injuries. But these sounds were different because they were ongoing, not the result of single traumatic events. When I reached the pediatric ward, I found a scene that will stay with me for the rest of my life. 3 reanimated patients had cornered a group of nurses and children in the playroom at the end of the hall. The children were crying, the nurses were trying to shield them, and the reanimated patients were advancing slowly with that mechanical, purposeful movement I'd come to recognize. One of the reanimated patients was Maria Santos, the woman who had been attacked by her neighbor David Chen. She died from her bite wounds 2 days earlier, and now she was part of the same hunting pack that Chen had become. The cycle was continuing, expanding, creating more predators from each victim. What made the scene even more horrifying was that one of the reanimated patients was a child, a 7-year-old boy named Timothy who had been brought in with bite wounds 3 days earlier. He'd died despite our best efforts, and now he was moving with the same predatory instincts as the adult reanimated patients. The reanimation process didn't discriminate based on age. I realized I was going to have to fight creatures that had once been my patients, including a child I'd tried to save. This was the moment when everything I'd learned about medicine and everything I'd learned about combat came into direct conflict. My medical oath told me to do no harm, but my responsibility to protect the living told me that these creatures were no longer patients. I approached from behind, using the crowbar to incapacitate Maria Santos first. The blow to her head stopped her movement immediately, but I could still hear that irregular heartbeat that seemed to be the only vital sign the reanimated patients maintained. She was down but not permanently disabled, which meant she could potentially reanimate again if I didn't do something more decisive. The sound of the impact attracted the attention of the other 2 reanimated patients, including Timothy. They turned toward me with that mechanical movement, their white eyes fixing on me with predatory focus. I was now the primary target, which meant the nurses and children had a chance to escape. I shouted for the nurses to get the children out of the playroom while I held off the reanimated patients. But I quickly realized that fighting 2 of them simultaneously was going to be more challenging than dealing with one. They didn't coordinate their attacks like living people might, but they also didn't get in each other's way. They both advanced on me at the same time, and I had to decide which one posed the greater immediate threat. Timothy was smaller and slower, but he was also closer to me. The adult reanimated patient was larger and potentially stronger, but he was farther away. I decided to deal with Timothy first, even though the idea of using a weapon against a child, even a reanimated one, went against every instinct I had as both a doctor and a human being. I used the hammer to incapacitate Timothy, targeting the base of his skull where I knew the spinal cord connected to the brain. It was a precise blow based on my knowledge of human anatomy, designed to sever the connection between the brain and the rest of the body. Timothy collapsed immediately, and unlike with the other reanimated patients, I couldn't hear a heartbeat from his body. The third reanimated patient reached me just as I was confirming that Timothy was no longer a threat. I used the crowbar to block his attempt to grab me, but his strength was greater than I'd expected. The reanimated patients didn't seem to have the same physical limitations as living people. They could exert maximum force without worrying about muscle strain or joint damage. I managed to get behind him and used the bone saw to sever his spinal cord at the neck. It was a procedure I'd performed on cadavers during medical school, but never on something that was moving and actively trying to attack me. The reanimated patient collapsed, his body going limp as the connection between his brain and motor functions was severed. The pediatric ward was finally secure, but the cost had been enormous. I'd been forced to use lethal force against creatures that had once been my patients, including a child. The nurses and remaining children were safe, but they were looking at me with a mixture of gratitude and fear. They'd seen me save them, but they'd also seen me kill. I organized the evacuation of the pediatric ward, prioritizing the most vulnerable children and the nurses who were essential for their care. But I also had to deal with the 3 incapacitated reanimated patients. I couldn't leave them where they might recover and pose a threat to future rescue teams, but I also couldn't bring myself to ensure they were permanently deceased. I decided to secure them in a supply closet where they couldn't threaten anyone else, but where they also wouldn't be discovered immediately. It was a compromise that satisfied neither my medical training nor my combat training, but it was the best I could do given the circumstances. The evacuation of the pediatric ward took 2 trips with the Chevelle. The military perimeter was still dealing with the convoy situation, which gave me the opportunity to get the children and nurses to safety without being stopped. But I could see that the situation outside the hospital was deteriorating rapidly. The convoy had apparently decided to take the hospital by force. They were engaging the military in a firefight, using the same kind of older vehicles that were immune to the electromagnetic pulse. I could see muzzle flashes from both sides, and it was clear that the quarantine was breaking down completely. I realized that we were now facing threats from 3 different directions. The reanimated patients inside the hospital, the military, trying to maintain quarantine outside, and the convoy group that was trying to break through the perimeter with unknown intentions. The situation was becoming more complex by the hour. When I returned to the hospital for the next evacuation run, I found that the remaining staff had barricaded themselves in the main surgical suite. It was the most defensible location in the building, with only 2 entrances that could be easily secured. But it was also a trap if the reanimated patients found a way inside. Dr. Martinez had taken charge in my absence, organizing the remaining staff into teams responsible for different aspects of survival. One team was monitoring the reanimated patients and tracking their movements through the hospital. Another team was managing the limited medical supplies we had left. A third team was maintaining communication with the outside, trying to figure out what was happening with the military and the convoy. The team monitoring the reanimated patients reported that their behavior was evolving. They were starting to move in larger groups, apparently drawn together by some kind of instinct or communication method we didn't understand. They were also becoming more aggressive, more focused in their hunting behavior. What was most concerning was that the reanimated patients seemed to be learning from their encounters with living people. They were avoiding areas where they'd been successfully repelled, and they were focusing their attention on areas where they'd had success finding victims. This suggested a level of adaptation that went beyond simple, instinctual behavior. I shared my observations about the reanimated patients' weaknesses and vulnerabilities with the remaining staff. They could be incapacitated by damage to the head or spinal cord, but they were much stronger and more resilient than living people. They were attracted to sound and movement, but they could be avoided by staying quiet and still. I also warned them about the evolving tactical situation outside the hospital. The military quarantine was breaking down, and we were going to have to deal with multiple groups of armed people who might have very different ideas about what should happen to the hospital and its survivors. The team maintaining outside communication reported that the convoy group had identified themselves as a civilian rescue organization called the Phoenix Emergency Response Coalition. They claimed to be evacuating survivors from quarantine zones throughout the city, and they were demanding that the military allow them to evacuate our hospital. But the military was insisting that the quarantine protocols had to be maintained, that allowing people to leave the containment zone would risk spreading the reanimation process to uncontaminated areas. The standoff was escalating, and it was only a matter of time before the firefight resumed. I decided to take advantage of the temporary ceasefire to complete the evacuation of the hospital. We had about 20 people left, including several critical patients who couldn't be moved easily. I was going to need multiple trips with the Chevelle, and I was going to have to time them carefully to avoid both the reanimated patients and the armed groups outside. The first evacuation run went smoothly. I was able to get 5 more people past the perimeter while the military and the convoy were still negotiating. But when I returned for the second run, I found that the situation inside the hospital had changed dramatically. The reanimated patients had found a way into the surgical suite. They'd apparently learned to work together to break through the barricades, using a level of coordination that suggested they were developing new capabilities. The remaining staff were trapped in the operating rooms, with reanimated patients controlling the main corridor. I realized that the safe zones we'd established weren't going to hold much longer. The reanimated patients were adapting to our defensive strategies, and they were becoming more effective hunters. We were going to have to abandon the hospital completely, even if it meant leaving some people behind. I fought my way through the corridor to reach the operating rooms, using the weapons I'd acquired and the knowledge of reanimated patient behavior I'd developed. But I was also running low on energy and resources. The constant stress of combat, combined with the emotional trauma of fighting creatures that had been patients, was taking its toll. When I reached the operating rooms, I found Dr. Martinez and the remaining staff in a desperate situation. They had medical supplies but no weapons, and the reanimated patients were trying to break through the doors. The barricades were holding for now, but it was only a matter of time before they failed. I organized a fighting retreat toward the parking garage, using furniture and equipment to slow down the reanimated patients while we moved the remaining survivors. But I had to make hard decisions about who could be evacuated and who would have to be left behind. Some of the critical patients simply couldn't be moved without equipment we didn't have. The retreat to the parking garage became a running battle through the hospital corridors. The reanimated patients seemed to be everywhere, drawn by the sound of our movement and the scent of living people. I was using every weapon I could find, every tactic I'd learned in Afghanistan, but I was also improvising strategies specifically for fighting creatures that felt no pain and didn't tire. I discovered that the reanimated patients could be temporarily disabled by damage to their joints, even if they couldn't feel pain. A blow to the knee would interfere with their ability to walk. A blow to the shoulder would interfere with their ability to grab. It wasn't permanent, but it could buy us time to escape. When we finally reached the parking garage, I realized that we were facing our most difficult evacuation yet. We had 12 people who needed to get out, but the Chevelle could only carry 4 at a time. That meant at least 3 trips through increasingly dangerous territory, with reanimated patients and armed groups both posing threats. I made the decision to prioritize the most vulnerable people for the first evacuation run. The remaining staff would have to hold the parking garage until I could return for them. It was a calculated risk based on my assessment of who was most likely to survive extended siege situation. As I was loading the first group into the Chevelle, I heard something that confirmed my worst fears about the situation outside the hospital. The sound of automatic weapons fire, much heavier than the sporadic shooting we'd heard before. The ceasefire between the military and the convoy had broken down completely, and we were about to drive into the middle of a full-scale battle. I realized that completing the evacuation was going to require more than just avoiding reanimated patients. I was going to have to navigate through an active combat zone, using tactics I'd learned in Afghanistan to avoid getting caught in the crossfire, between 2 groups of armed people who probably wouldn't distinguish between hostile and non-hostile targets. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and I was going to have to make split-second decisions that would determine who lived and who died. The next few hours were going to test everything I'd learned as both a combat medic and a trauma surgeon, and I wasn't sure I was prepared for what was coming. But I also knew that the people depending on me didn't have any other options. I was their only chance of getting out of the hospital alive, and I was going to have to find a way to get them through whatever was waiting outside. As I started the Chevelle and prepared to drive into the unknown, I realized that this wasn't just about medicine anymore. This was about survival in a world where the rules had fundamentally changed, and I was going to have to become something I'd never been before. Driving through an active combat zone while evacuating hospital patients wasn't something they'd covered in medical school. But my Afghanistan experience was proving invaluable as I navigated the Chevelle through the chaos outside St. Mary's Hospital. The Phoenix Emergency Response Coalition and the military were engaged in a full firefight, with both sides using the hospital parking lot as cover while they tried to outflank each other. I kept the headlights off and used the emergency lighting from the burning vehicles to navigate through the combat zone. The Chevelle's older engine was loud enough that both sides could hear me coming, but they were too focused on each other to pay much attention to a single civilian vehicle trying to escape the area. The first evacuation run was successful, but barely. I took a route through the residential neighborhoods surrounding the hospital, avoiding the main roads where the military had established checkpoints. What I saw during that drive confirmed that the reanimation process wasn't limited to our hospital. Phoenix was in the early stages of a complete societal collapse. I saw abandoned cars scattered along the streets, their doors left open like people had fled in panic. Houses with broken windows and doors, signs of forced entry and violent struggle. But most disturbing were the bodies I could see in yards and driveways, some of them showing the distinctive bite wounds that I now knew would lead to reanimation in about 30 hours. The safe house I'd established was an abandoned auto repair shop about 3 miles from the hospital. It was defensible, had multiple exits, and was far enough from populated areas that we were unlikely to encounter large groups of reanimated patients. The building also had a good view of the surrounding area, which would help us spot threats before they reached us. When I returned to the hospital for the second evacuation run, the situation had deteriorated even further. The Phoenix Emergency Response Coalition had apparently won their firefight with the military, because I could see their vehicles now controlling the hospital perimeter. But that didn't necessarily mean they were friendly to hospital survivors. I managed to get close enough to the parking garage to pick up the second group of evacuees, but I could see coalition members moving through the hospital building. They were armed with military-grade weapons and seemed to be conducting a systematic search of the facility. I wasn't sure if they were looking for survivors to rescue or threats to eliminate. Dr. Martinez was in the second group, one evacuated, along with 3 nurses and 2 patients who were stable enough to travel. During the drive to the safe house, Dr. Martinez told me what he'd observed about the coalition members who had entered the hospital. They were wearing protective gear similar to what the military had been using, but their tactics were different. Instead of trying to contain the reanimated patients, they seemed to be actively hunting them. Martinez had watched them moving through the hospital corridors in coordinated teams, systematically clearing each room and eliminating any reanimated patients they encountered. This suggested that the coalition had extensive experience dealing with the reanimation process, more experience than the military seemed to have. They knew how to fight these creatures effectively, which meant they'd probably encountered them in other locations throughout Phoenix. When I returned for the third and final evacuation run, I found that the coalition had completely secured the hospital. The remaining reanimated patients had been eliminated, and coalition members were now conducting what looked like a medical assessment of the facility. They were testing surfaces for contamination, collecting biological samples, and documenting everything they found. The final group of evacuees included our most critical patients, people who probably shouldn't have been moved, but who had no choice given the circumstances. I was worried about their ability to survive the trip to the safe house, but I was more worried about what would happen if they fell into coalition hands before I could determine their intentions. During the final evacuation run, I encountered my first coalition checkpoint. 2 vehicles had blocked the road about a mile from the hospital, and armed personnel were stopping anyone trying to leave the area. I had to make a split-second decision about whether to try to talk my way through or find an alternate route. I decided to approach the checkpoint and see how the coalition members reacted to medical personnel evacuating patients. The conversation that followed gave me crucial information about what was happening throughout Phoenix and what we could expect in the days ahead. The coalition checkpoint leader was a former Army medic named Sarah Chen, no relation to David Chen, who had been our first reanimated patient. She told me that Phoenix was experiencing what they called a Category 3 outbreak, meaning that more than 30% of the population was either dead or reanimated. According to Sarah, the electromagnetic pulse had been deliberate, not the result of a solar flare. It was part of a coordinated attack designed to disable communication and transportation systems while introducing the reanimation virus through the water supply. The bite transmission was just the secondary infection vector, designed to accelerate the spread once the initial phase was complete. This information completely changed my understanding of what we were dealing with. This wasn't a natural disaster or an accidental outbreak. This was a planned attack on American infrastructure, designed to create maximum chaos and civilian casualties. The reanimated patients weren't the result of some unknown disease. They were biological weapons. Sarah also told me that similar attacks had occurred in at least 6 other major cities across the United States. Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, Atlanta, Denver, and Seattle were all reporting electromagnetic pulses followed by widespread reanimation events. The federal government had essentially collapsed, and local authorities were trying to maintain order using whatever resources they had available. The coalition was one of several civilian organizations that had formed in response to the attacks. Their mission was to evacuate survivors from contaminated areas and establish secure communities in regions that hadn't been affected by the electromagnetic pulses. But they were also competing with other organizations that had different ideas about how to handle the crisis. Sarah warned me that Phoenix was about to become a battleground between different survival groups, each with their own agenda for dealing with the reanimated patients and the collapsed infrastructure. Some groups wanted to eliminate all reanimated patients and attempt to rebuild civilization. Others wanted to study the reanimation process and potentially weaponize it for their own purposes. She gave me coordinates for a coalition evacuation point about 50 miles outside Phoenix, where they were establishing a permanent settlement for outbreak survivors. But she also warned me that the route to the evacuation point was controlled by a group called the New Arizona Militia, who were hostile to coalition operations and were trying to establish their own territorial control. I realized that our immediate survival depended on more than just avoiding reanimated patients. We were now part of a larger conflict between different human factions, each with their own vision of what the post-outbreak world should look like. The choices I made over the next few days would determine not just who survived, but what kind of society we would be part of. When I reached the safe house with the final group of evacuees, I found that the earlier groups had been busy establishing defensive positions and organizing our limited supplies. The auto repair shop was well suited for our needs, with multiple vehicle bays that could be secured independently and a second floor that provided good visibility of the surrounding area. I called everyone together to share the information I'd learned from the coalition checkpoint. The news that the outbreak was the result of a coordinated attack rather than a natural disaster was disturbing, but it also helped explain some of the patterns we'd observed. The systematic nature of the reanimation process, the coordinated behavior of the reanimated patients, and the apparent preparation of groups like the coalition. I also had to address the question of what we were going to do next. We had 23 survivors, limited medical supplies, and no clear plan for long-term survival. The coalition evacuation point offered security and resources, but it would also mean surrendering our independence and accepting their authority over our group. Dr. Martinez argued for joining the coalition, pointing out that we didn't have the resources or expertise to survive independently in the post-outbreak environment. The nurses were divided, with some wanting to continue providing medical care to other survivors, and others wanting to focus on the security of our own group. I found myself in the position of making decisions that would affect everyone's future. Decisions that went far beyond medical triage or combat tactics. I was essentially choosing what kind of society we'd try to build in the aftermath of civilization's collapse. The debate was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching the safe house. Through the windows, I could see a convoy of military-style vehicles that didn't match either the coalition or the military units we'd encountered at the hospital. These vehicles were newer, better equipped, and moving with the kind of coordination that suggested professional military training. The convoy stopped about 200 yards from the safe house, and armed personnel began deploying in tactical formations around our building. This wasn't a rescue operation or a chance encounter. This was a planned assault on our position, conducted by people who knew exactly where we were and what they were doing. I organized our defense using the same principles I'd applied to securing the hospital, but our situation was much more precarious. We had limited weapons, untrained personnel, and nowhere to retreat if our defenses failed. The auto repair shop had good defensive positions, but it was also a trap if we couldn't break out when necessary. The attacking force made no attempt to communicate with us before beginning their assault. They used coordinated small unit tactics to approach the building, employing suppressing fire and tactical movement that indicated extensive military training. This wasn't a group of civilian survivors or local militia members. This was a professional military unit operating with specific objectives. I realized that our location had been compromised, probably through information obtained from coalition sources or through surveillance we hadn't detected. The timing of the attack, coming just hours after our evacuation from the hospital, suggested that someone had been tracking our movements and waiting for us to establish a fixed position. The assault began with an attempt to breach the main entrance using explosive charges. The blast damaged our primary defensive position and created an entry point that the attacking force immediately began to exploit. I had to make rapid decisions about how to deploy our limited defensive resources while also protecting the non-combatant members of our group. I assigned the medical staff to secure positions in the rear of the building while I organized the few people with military or law enforcement experience into defensive teams. But I quickly realized that we were outmatched in terms of both numbers and equipment. Our only advantage was our knowledge of the building's layout and our motivation to protect the vulnerable members of our group. The fighting that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced in Afghanistan. The attacking force was using non-lethal weapons and capture tactics rather than simply trying to eliminate us. They wanted us alive, which suggested that we had value to them beyond just being potential threats or obstacles. During a brief lull in the fighting, the assault leader used a loudspeaker to make demands. They identified themselves as representatives of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, operating under emergency powers granted by the President following the coordinated attacks on American cities. They demanded that we surrender all medical personnel and research materials related to the reanimation process. This demand revealed why we were being targeted. As medical professionals who had direct experience with reanimated patients, we possessed knowledge that was valuable to government agencies trying to understand and counter the biological weapon that had been used against American cities. We weren't just survivors, we were intelligence assets. I realized that surrendering to FEMA would probably mean indefinite detention, while they extracted everything we knew about the reanimation process. But continuing to resist would likely result in casualties among the non-combatant members of our group. I was facing another impossible choice between competing moral obligations. The decision was made for me. When one of the FEMA assault teams breached our rear defensive position and began moving toward the area where we'd secured the medical staff and patients, I couldn't allow them to capture people who were under my protection, even if it meant escalating the conflict. I organized a counterattack using the vehicle bays as covered positions, employing the same small unit tactics the assault teams were using, but with the advantage of fighting on familiar ground. The counterattack was successful in forcing the FEMA teams to withdraw from the building, but it also demonstrated that they were willing to use lethal force when their non-lethal approach failed. The siege that followed lasted through the night and into the next day. FEMA maintained a perimeter around the auto repair shop while apparently waiting for reinforcements or new orders. During this time, I was able to observe their equipment and tactics, gathering intelligence that would be crucial for our eventual escape. I also had time to think about the larger implications of our situation. If FEMA was actively hunting medical personnel who had experience with reanimated patients, then similar operations were probably being conducted throughout the affected cities. The government was apparently trying to consolidate control over information about the biological weapon, possibly to develop countermeasures or to weaponize the reanimation process for their own purposes. The breakthrough came when I realized that the FEMA teams were using the same communication protocols I'd learned in Afghanistan. Their radio chatter revealed that they were expecting a resupply convoy to arrive the following morning, and that they planned to use heavy equipment to breach our defensive positions if we hadn't surrendered by then. I developed an escape plan based on this intelligence, using the Chevelle and 2 other working vehicles we'd found in the auto shop to break through the FEMA perimeter during the early morning hours when their surveillance would be reduced. The plan required precise timing and coordination, but it offered our best chance of reaching coalition territory before FEMA could organize pursuit. The escape was successful, but it came at a cost. We had to leave behind most of our medical supplies and some equipment that would have been valuable for long-term survival. We also had to accept that FEMA now knew our identities and would probably continue hunting us as we tried to reach safety. During the drive to coalition territory, I reflected on how much had changed in just 72 hours. I'd gone from being a trauma surgeon focused on saving individual lives to being a combat leader responsible for the survival of an entire group. The skills I'd learned in Afghanistan had proven more valuable than my medical training, at least in terms of immediate survival. But I also realized that my medical knowledge had become a liability in the post-outbreak world. Government agencies, civilian organizations, and military groups all wanted to control information about the reanimation process, and they were willing to use force to obtain that control. Being a doctor who had treated reanimated patients made me a target rather than an asset. When we finally reached coalition territory, I had to make another difficult decision about our group's future. The coalition offered security and resources, but they also wanted to exploit our medical knowledge for their own purposes. Joining them would mean giving up our independence, but remaining independent would mean facing constant threats from groups like FEMA. I chose to negotiate a middle ground, agreeing to share medical information about the reanimation process in exchange for protection and resources for our group. But I also insisted on maintaining operational independence, preserving our ability to make our own decisions about treatment and research priorities. The coalition accepted these terms, recognizing that our experience was valuable enough to justify some flexibility in their normal integration procedures. They assigned us to a research facility where we could continue studying the reanimation process while also providing medical care to other outbreak survivors. 72 hours ago, I was a surgeon who thought his biggest challenge would be keeping patients alive without electricity. Now I'm something else entirely, something that combines medical knowledge with combat skills and leadership abilities that I never knew I possessed. The outbreak didn't just change the world, it changed who I am as a person. If you're listening to this recording, you're probably facing some of the same challenges I faced during those first 72 hours. The world has changed in ways that make traditional medical and social structures obsolete. Survival depends on adapting quickly to new realities, while maintaining the moral principles that define who you are as a human being. The reanimated patients are just one threat among many in the post-outbreak world. Government agencies, civilian militias, resource competition, and infrastructure collapse all pose challenges that require different strategies and responses. Success depends on understanding that this isn't just a medical crisis, it's a complete transformation of society. My advice to other survivors is to focus on building sustainable communities rather than just individual survival. The knowledge and skills that kept our group alive came from combining medical expertise, military training, and civilian leadership abilities. No single person has everything needed to survive in the post-outbreak world. Most importantly, don't lose sight of what makes you human. The choices you make about who to save, who to trust, and what principles to maintain will determine not just whether you survive, but what kind of person you become in the process. The outbreak may have changed the rules, but it doesn't have to change who you are at your core. The next phase of survival is going to require rebuilding civilization from the ground up, using the lessons we've learned from the collapse of the old world. That's a challenge that will take years or decades to complete, but it starts with the decisions we make in these first critical hours after everything changes.